So thanks for staying till the end of Sunday. I thought what I'd do today is try and go through some of the stuff that we've been trying to get across in the media. The Australian media has been pretty good. If you look at the American media or even the British media, there's been lots and lots of scaremongering, lots and lots of speculation about what causes this and not really much of the facts, whereas the Australian media has tended to come to people like me and my colleagues to discuss this. So I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm an academic in public health, and I spend a lot of my time teaching how to control infectious diseases. And we have a multidisciplinary institute called the Marie Bashir Institute for Infectious Diseases and Biosecurity that really tries to address this from across medicine, vet, social sciences, law, and policy to actually control infectious diseases globally. So what I'll do today is go through some of the history of Ebola in general, this current outbreak, and just dispel some of the myths that we've been coming across. So Ebola hasn't been with us that long as a recognized disease. It first appeared around 1976. It's probably been occurring in outbreaks in Africa way before that. But in 76, in an area around what was formerly Zaire, on the Ebola River, which is where it got its name from, there were a number of cases of an unknown illness that particularly was noticed by a missionary hospital out in Zaire at the time, who happened to be in contact with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a PO who worked there, who was able to identify that this was a novel virus. This was very different and hadn't been seen before. And it was from that outbreak which actually, because it got into the health service, it transmitted across a number of people in the hospital, it caused a large number of cases and had the very scary fatality of about 88%, which is one of the really fear-provoking things that Ebola causes. The biggest outbreak up to date, up to this current one, was actually in Uganda in around 2000, 2001, where there were around nearly 400 cases with a fatality of around 38%, so less than what we'd seen before, less than the kind of 80 or 90% that a lot of the media has been talking about. And that was down to starting to understand how you can get patients through this. And I'll talk a bit about that later. But this current outbreak occurred somewhere where no one ever expected it to occur, which was actually a bit naive. We should have expected it to occur here, and I'll show you why. It actually first appeared in this little area called Miliandu, which is a village in Grakdu province. And this whole area here from Google Maps is West Africa. And this very large country, quite sparsely populated with about 4 or 5 million people, is Guinea. So it was in a very rural area of Guinea that the first case was seen. This first case actually occurred in a 2-year-old child. And what we now know from looking at the genomics of the virus that's transmitted through Guinea, but also from going back and doing epidemiology studies, is that this child was the child of a mother who, because of the hard times, there's been very large amounts of inflation in Guinea, she couldn't really feed her family, so she couldn't go out to the market and get food anymore. So what she did instead was go out into the field, use a shotgun at a tree of fruit bats, and managed to collect some fruit bats. Now, the delicacy in West Africa is to eat these bats raw. So she was preparing this raw bat, which is apparently very nice, and some of the blood from that bat must have contaminated her child, and he either inhaled it or ate it in some way. And so her 2-year-old child became what was known as patient 0, so the first point of this outbreak. After that, the mother was actually pregnant. Because her son came down with the illness, she inevitably got the illness as well, caring for him. She unfortunately miscarried and later died. But when she miscarried, she was seen by a midwife. That midwife then went around the community seeing other children. Other members of the community were involved. When the grandmother died, she went back to her native village. The tradition of burials in this part of West Africa, it's a big 5 to 7 day process where you take the body, you bathe it in water, everyone in the village helps cleanse the body. They then actually drink from that water that they've just cleansed the body with. And this is meant to help the body the friend or relative go to their afterlife. And so you can imagine how this is a great way of actually transmitting a virus. So from that, this spread out, and for a long time, no one recognized what it was. On January the 24th, so the very first case happened end of December last year, by January 24th, there'd been enough cases for people to start to get suspicious. So there was worry that this was some kind of unknown disease. So the local hospital in Grant Hill province then looked into this, and the only real test they had was a test for cholera. And this part of West Africa has had lots of cholera outbreaks. Many of the symptoms of Ebola are diffuse vomiting and diarrhea. And actually, the diarrhea is so bad that you tend to lose 6 to 7 liters of fluid a day, which looks exactly like cholera. So the obvious thing to do was to test for cholera. And in this hospital, they had tests for that. They were very, very sensitive, but not very specific. So actually, of the 7 people they tested, 6 of the 7 came back as positive for cholera. This is a great example of how disease surveillance can go wrong. It's great to have a sensitive test if you don't want to miss any cases, but it's very problematic if you don't actually know what you're dealing with. And in this case, it sent everyone on a wild goose chase. Everyone thought they were dealing with cholera. No one really understood what was causing this. Until this chap, who is Professor Van Herp, who works for the World Health Organization, and he happened to be looking at a fax. And the World Health Organization is one of the few organizations I know that still uses fax machines. He looked at a fax that had come through, and one of the key symptoms that was occurring in this outbreak was hiccups. And so if you ever have a family member who has hiccups and you want to scare them, just tell them that this is one of the cardinal symptoms of Ebola. He cottoned on that these people had hiccups. You don't see hiccups in cholera. There might be more going on here. He immediately got in contact with Médecins Sans Frontières, who have been the real heroes throughout this outbreak. And they went and got samples from the patient, sent it to the Institut Pasteur, and eventually got positive samples back showing that this was the Ebola virus. From that point onwards, though, Médecins Sans Frontières started a whole army of people going in to try and deal with this outbreak. They contacted the World Health Organization. We know that the response from them has been a bit slow. And actually, it wasn't until March of this year when the World Health Organization finally said that we had some kind of problem on our hands. But this wasn't declared a public health emergency of international concern until August. And then we've constantly been playing catch-up since then. So what's this meant? This is now the biggest outbreak of Ebola we've ever seen. It's actually affected more people than all the previous outbreaks since 1976 put together. And we're now at the point where there's been 16,000 cases that we know about. There's probably 2 times more than that in reality, and around 5,700 deaths. These figures are constantly going up, and in particular, the major issue with this outbreak has been it is very widespread. So all of these circles are cases, patient cases, and you can see that the whole of Sierra Leone is covered, the majority of Guinea, most of Liberia, and we've now got cases in Mali, for example, an unknown number of cases in Mali. So this has been far more widespread than Ebola, which normally just affects small rural areas that don't have good transport links, that gets recognized fairly early, quarantine and infection control is put in place, and that outbreak is damped down. What we've seen here is the first time Ebola has gone into urban areas, the first time it's actually gone across country borders. We've never seen a multiple country outbreak in this way, and the first time that we've actually had such widespread outbreaks over a huge area, including in densely populated urban cities. Now, you may have heard a lot about Ebola in the press during September, a little bit in October, and it's now gone a bit quiet. The reason it's gone a bit quiet is partly due to these epidemic curves. So these are curves of the number of cases with time. You can see with Guinea, the outbreak is still continuing, and it's still bubbling along with a few hundred cases occurring every day. In Liberia, which really caused a big panic around the end of August, start of September, when you saw this huge spike in the number of cases, so 500 cases of this a day, has luckily gone down, and a lot of that is the work of the United States, who have put in place treatment units to get on top of this. But with Sierra Leone, this situation is still dire. You're still seeing 500 to 600 cases a day, and the big problem with all of this is as soon as we turn to look at another health emergency, and there's 16 of these emergencies going on around the world at the moment, So as soon as the community's attention goes away, you will start to see cases flare up again. So there's still a big impetus on the whole global community to get on top of this. So these are all the previous cases and the number of cases and the fatality in each of them. And as you can see, Uganda, as I said before, has suffered the biggest in the past, but really the largest by far is this current outbreak. So, myth 1. First myth was that Ebola is an escaped bioweapon. If anyone knows anything about bioweapons, anything about Ebola, it would be a pretty awful bioweapon to try and use. A lot of Republicans in the United States suggested that this might be Obama, either causing this or causing the attention to be focused on it. And the big cynics have suggested this is a method of population control, which is slightly ironic that this is one of the least sparsely densely populated areas within Africa. So where has this come from? So it's a zoonotic disease. It's a disease that accidentally spills over from animals into humans. We know that the main reservoir of this disease is bats, and whenever we look at previous outbreaks, the question marks, we didn't really get on top of this, but you can see in many of them, bats were the precursor, were the thing that people got infected from. The other big area you can get infected from is monkeys, so non-human primates in general. And these, again, are a food source. They're a source of bushmeat in a large part of Africa. And so Ebola lives happily in bats, and bats, we now know, are the harbingers of lots and lots of viruses. They teeming with viruses, they don't get unwell from them, and these viruses constantly circulate in bat populations. Occasionally you get spillover into other animals, mostly non-human primates, some deer, both of which we might eat, but also humans might also directly come in contact with bats or might eat them and get infected in that way. That then goes into communities, and the main way that it transmits in communities is from people looking after their loved ones who have profuse vomiting and diarrhea and getting contaminated with those secretions. The other big risk, as I said before, is traditional burials, and certainly this practice of these long burials with large amounts of touching of the bodies makes this a very easy place to spread this virus. What's happened in this outbreak, though, is you've then gone into urban towns and cities, and you've continued that cycle. And the big problem with Ebola and many hemorrhagic fevers has always been in healthcare facilities. So ever since it was first found in 1976 up to now, you see a large number of healthcare workers being infected. So in Liberia, which has 40 doctors in the whole country at the start of this, half of those doctors are now dead. Overall, nearly 600 healthcare workers have been infected in West Africa, and half of those are now dead. So this is a very dangerous thing for healthcare professionals. Again, as I said before, we should have expected to have seen this. We have seen that the bats, the main fruit bats that carry the virus, have been present in West Africa for a long time. There's even a study back in the late 90s that showed you could find antibodies against Ebola in the serum of people living in West Africa. So people were getting infected for a long time, and you could actually test bats and find the virus there. So we knew it was there. And as I'll come back to at the end, we need to do more in the world at looking at surveillance and more thinking about how we can build up countries to recognize when these illnesses first emerge into their country. So myth 2 is this looks like outbreak. And if you've ever read The Hot Zone or you've seen the film Outbreak, it's a very scary disease. You just get huge amounts of bleeding from every orifice, and then at the end you find a monkey and you've saved the day. This isn't actually the case, unfortunately. The incubation period, which everyone's been talking about, can be up to 21 days. And during this incubation period, the virus is replicating away in your body. And it's only when your immune system really recognizes a virus and starts to deal with it that you start to get the symptoms. Those symptoms typically occur after about a week, although can be up to 21 days. And it looks like every other tropical illness that you'll get in Africa. So you have a fever as a first symptom, you have a bit of myalgia, so your muscles ache, you have a headache, and you feel tired. So that looks exactly like malaria, it looks like typhoid, it looks like every other thing under the sun that you might catch while in Africa. On day 10, the fever peaks, so it gets into the high 30s, early 40s. People start to vomit, they become very passive, and then by the next day they have quite profuse diarrhea. Their capillaries are starting to break down in their body, so they do have bruising all over the body, and you might start to get some bleeding occurring. And then on day 12, you get loss of consciousness. You tend to get either a mixture of the liver just not being able to produce factors anymore, or you get encephalitis, and these patients die. So you can see why this is so scary. You go from having a fever to being dead within 3 or 4 days. In a recent paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, the doctors who have been on the ground, mostly in MSF, who've been treating these patients, were looking at what we've been seeing as a clinical syndrome there. It's had relatively low mortality in younger patients, so about 20% mortality in younger patients. Most of the deaths have been seen in people over 40. And we don't really know why this is. It could be due to immune system responses, but that's still under investigation. What's interesting about this outbreak and previous outbreaks is actually 50% of people that get Ebola won't even have symptoms. So they'll actually have an antibody response, and you can go out and test these, but they won't become ill from it. So this is why I say that the number of cases may be much higher than we're actually currently estimating. The other interesting thing about this particular outbreak is only about 5% of people had any signs of bleeding. So the majority of the cases were vomiting and diarrhea. So this isn't the kind of Armageddon scenario that you imagine with Ebola. So a lot of the press were very excited, and I don't know if any of you have Facebook friends in the US. My partner's American, so we were watching this on a daily basis, and everyone thought the zombie apocalypse was coming to the US, particularly when they were bringing back people like Kent Brantley, who was a doctor infected overseas. Bringing him back and treating him would mean that suddenly the Walking Dead would be on your doorstep. One, the virus is not airborne. This is a relatively difficult virus to catch if you know what you're doing. So this is a great piece from the Huffington Post that really points out that this requires close contact with the patient's secretions to actually become infected yourself. And those secretions, be it vomit or diarrhea or large amounts of saliva, has to actually enter into your mucous membrane. So you need to get that into your eye, your nose, or your mouth to actually catch the disease. That typically happens because people caring for their relative are touching them and then wipe their nose or wipe their eyes and then inadvertently infect themselves. What we know is that this isn't airborne. So by airborne, I mean it doesn't generate an aerosol. So if I was standing in front of you now and I had tuberculosis, this is an aerosol transmitted disease, and I was talking for half an hour, all of you guys would now have TB. So it's a very easy disease to transmit and pass on to people. With Ebola, you'd all be completely safe, unless I managed to spit in your eye or something like that. So it's not airborne in the traditional sense like influenza or measles or anything else is. This is despite what has been said in the media by some people, and I'll come back to that. It's also not waterborne. It can be killed by cooking your food, so just don't eat your bats raw if you decide to. It's not transmitted through mosquitoes, and once someone has survived Ebola, as long as you don't have unprotected sex with them, you won't catch it. The interesting thing with Ebola is the virus does exist in semen for up to 3 months afterwards, and that's something we'll have to keep an eye on in West Africa in the next few months. So, why is there this constant question of whether it's airborne? It's because of a few papers like this one that came out in Scientific Reports, which is one of the new open access journals. And this was an experiment where they had a load of pigs in one room, a load of primates in a separate room that had cages between them, so only really air could pass between them. They infected the pigs with Ebola, and they found some of the primates got infected. And so the conclusion from this was that those pigs were obviously breathing out virus, and the monkeys were getting infected. The big problem, though, was at the end of each day, because all these pigs were really ill and were vomiting and had diarrhea, they'd go in with a pressure washer and clean the floors. You can imagine that whenever you have large amounts of vomit around and you spray it around the whole room, that those monkeys will then become infected. And so it's studies like this that really throw us off course on what we're looking at. And actually what we need to do is look at the lessons learned from this current epidemic. And this is one of the previous big epidemics that happened. And what they did was go back through communities, see what the risk factors were for actually getting Ebola, and they all occurred during late illness, and they were all very close proximity things. So sharing a meal, touching someone, being very close face-to-face, or sharing a bed. So all the kind of things that would expose you to secretions from that person. The other big study that was done looked at where you could actually find the virus. So does it live on surfaces? If I touch a door handle after you have been there, will I catch it? If I travel on the subway, which was a big concern in America, after a doctor's been on it who's come back from West Africa, will it be contaminated? And the answer is no. It's a fragile virus. It breaks down very quickly upon air contact. The best it could do was live actually within blood samples. So if you've got dried blood on the ground, that might contain Ebola for 1 or 2 days. But again, even after that, it breaks down. So it's not a big environmental risk. The other key information that we can take away is something called the R0. So the R0 is the number of people that get infected from each infectious case. If you have a case of measles in a school, for every one person that has measles, you can expect 16 to 18 people to get infected. For Ebola, it's tended to be around the 2 mark, and it's been even lower than that in some of the outbreaks, so 1 to 1.5. So this, again, is a clue that this isn't airborne. So one of the other big things you might have seen going around was all the amazing treatments that there are out there for Ebola. And particularly the colloidal silver one was a very interesting one that I wanted to deal with. This all comes down to this presentation. If you go and type in colloidal silver and Ebola into Google, references to this presentation would be there. This has the bald eagle seal. It's the American government. This was top secret research done by the American government that was classified for years because for some reason, if the American government had a cure for Ebola, they wouldn't want it to get out. I'm never quite sure what the thinking is behind that, but actually this was a scientific study that had nothing to do with any kind of conspiracy theories. It was part of Department of Defense research. What they were looking at was, can silver, which we know you can put in socks to stop smelly feet, you put in catheters to stop bacterial colonization. We know silver has antibacterial and antiviral properties. Can it do the same thing to Ebola? And so there's lots of slides in this, so I'm not going to go through. Effectively, what it shows is, yes, if Ebola and silver go into a cell, the Ebola virus can't then replicate. So that is encouraging if you want to be taking silver supplements. The big problem is this has never been a peer-reviewed article, so we don't really know how much rigorous testing this has gone through. It happened a long time ago and hasn't really been followed up. The conspiracy theorists say this is to protect drug companies. I don't actually believe that. I suspect they found that there were issues with the study. And actually one of the key premises of the study, which was a particular factor that it acts upon, has recently been shown to have no impact at all in Ebola replication. So there's a number of issues here. One, silver probably doesn't have this effect on Ebola, and also all the things that we've looked at with silver have been to prevent colonization by bacteria on inert surfaces. We've got no studies that show if you take silver by mouth, it kills bacteria or viruses. The other big thing that's been out there is homeopaths traveling over to West Africa, effectively on the premise that because it's untreatable, they're the ones to treat it. There's lots, the Light Party has been over there, and they've come up with all kinds of amazing ones. So rattlesnake venom, apparently, can cure Ebola, phosphorus, mercury, all kinds of things. If you add it to 1 in 10 billion water, or whatever it is, then it will cure it. I looked everywhere for evidence, for some kind of peer-reviewed information, and from all of Google Scholar, this is what I came up with. This is the evidence that homeopathy cures Ebola. The The big problem that this does is it distracts us from what we should be focusing on, and it's a big danger if these people are going over to West Africa trying to sell treatments that just aren't effective. Instead, we know good intensive care, use of things like ZMapp and vaccination is probably going to be far better. And particularly the evidence from ZMapp, and these were monkey trials, show that monkeys that don't have ZMapp die straight away, monkeys that get ZMapp up to 5 days afterwards all live. So that's much more interesting, and we should focus our efforts on that. And also, if we look at all the patients who were foreign expats infected in West Africa and taken back, they were all treated with some kind of antiviral or ZMapp, and there was a much higher level of survival, together with good intensive care, so monitoring of fluids, replacement of fluids and electrolytes. These people tend to survive. Again, in terms of vaccination, we've got a promising vaccine coming on the scene. This one by GlaxoSmithKline is actually chimpanzee adenovirus that expresses Ebola virus antigens, so bits of protein. And this has shown to be completely protective in primates. And a study that came out 2 days ago showed that this also generates antibodies in humans. So this is going into phase 2 trials now. We'll hopefully be ready in about 6 months. So if the epidemic is still continuing, we will have an effective vaccine against it. Final myth. This one keeps coming up, that Ebola virus, because it keeps traveling person to person, will mutate to become more transmissible or more virulent, as though this is something viruses do. This is a genome study that was done very early on in the outbreak, and it showed quite conclusively that the current, my pointer's completely died now, the current outbreak strain is very similar to previous ones. So it's got the same number of mutations that you'd expect of any RNA virus. And this has been backed up by study after study. And what we see with viruses is, viruses, if they're transmitting person to person quite happily, there's no evolutionary selection pressure there to make them mutate. We've never actually seen a virus mutate to become more virulent or mutate to become more transmissible. We've seen HIV infect millions of people around the world, but we've never seen airborne HIV. It just doesn't happen. And so this idea is actually going in the opposite direction. What we should actually be worried about is Ebola mutating to become less virulent. Because if a virus kills people too easily, and it then doesn't have a chance to be transmitted on, it has to become less virulent in order to stay in the population, or to be transmitted during the asymptomatic period, or things like that. So that's actually the real worry. Worrying about it mutating to become more transmissible isn't the question. So what should we actually be doing in the last couple of minutes? We should be doing what we know works. That is early testing, and now everyone in West Africa is within 24 hours of a lab that can test for Ebola, which is a huge improvement. We need good surveillance on the scene and on the ground. We need to build up these healthcare services so that they can actually carry this out themselves. And we need safe burials or cremation or some way of making sure that villagers aren't in contact with dead bodies. We need information for the public, and at the start there was a lot of misinformation. These were countries that have come from civil war, who traditionally don't trust their governments, and therefore if you suddenly get a team of CDC people in white hazmat suits and your relatives dying as soon as they've seen you, they start to get a little suspicious. And so a lot more public education is needed. And we're still a long way from actually getting on top of this. As you saw, the Sierra Leone figures are still dramatically scary. And this is because we still haven't got the funding. We still don't have governments around the world committing money and people and troops and everything else to actually deal with this. And there's one country in particular, Australia, that we've been trying to push to actually do a bit more. Because when you compare Australia's response to other countries around the world, it's been a bit lackluster. There are treatment units around West Africa. There's still a huge sparsity of them in Guinea, and there's a lack of them in the Ivory Coast and Mali. So we know there's other countries at risk that we need to get into now and be certain that we can recognize this virus if it appears there. So, treatment centers. We also need to educate people in home care so that they can care for their relatives in a safe way before they get them there. We need to stop banning flights. This causes huge problems for actually getting supplies and people in and out of the countries. We need to make sure communities are prepared, that we have community volunteers that can recognize the signs and symptoms. And once it's available, we need to think about how we can actually do a vaccination campaign. But the key thing with all of these countries is they have suffered from inequality for a long time. We could have seen this coming. You know that these people are relying on bushmeat. You know that we've seen massive deforestation. We've seen mining companies come in and push inflation through the roof. We know that the healthcare structures just aren't set up. So if the international community, particularly with the new Sustainable Development Goals, which will come out in 2015, we can really push to actually get countries ready to be able to deal with this and have surveillance in place. We can also make sure that we can detect these viruses in bats way before they ever get into humans. So we can actually nip these in the bud if we recognize them early enough. And actually, recent experience in Uganda has done exactly this. They recognize cases on the ground, they have a text messaging service to the Ministry of Health, and they get on top of these outbreaks very quickly. So what we do, this is just a plug for the Marie Bashir Institute, is we're trying to dispel many of these myths, like I've hopefully done today, and also educate the public and educate our government. And a lot of our role is now advocacy. So we go from everything from research through to policy to try and make sure that the government makes evidence-based policy making, which I think from skeptics among you should, be skeptical about what the government's already saying. If Tony Abbott is saying to you, we really can't send people to West Africa because it's dangerous and we can't get them back, question whether the UK and US governments have approached them early enough. They have done, they've been there constantly asking for help, and so there's been a reluctance on the government to get engaged in what they consider a non-Australian problem. So we will continue to push these agendas, and we'll continue to make sure, and with your help hopefully as well, look at articles in places like The Conversation, which is a great place and a great source for information, and we'll continue to keep infectious diseases up on the radar to make sure that we actually get equality within West Africa and the rest of the world so that we're ready for the next outbreak as it comes along. So I'll stop there, so we've got a couple of minutes for any questions. Thanks.
Just a quick question. Has any consideration been given to eliminating the virus at the root cause in the animals that are transmitting it?
So that would be one of the things that people are looking at. There's a huge amount of research into bats at the moment to see exactly why they're able to survive this. Because if we go out there and try and vaccinate bats, we know it probably won't have an impact because these bats are producing antibodies against the virus and keeping it in check. So there is a lot going on looking into this. But apart from widespread culling of all bats, we probably need to be a bit more sensible about our approach.
Yeah. Do we know why bats are a common reservoir or vector for several viral diseases?
Yeah, so actually another big outbreak at the moment, MERS coronavirus, is also bat in origin. And part of this is thought to be down to the mechanism that bats as mammals had to undergo during evolution to be able to fly. So they have huge metabolic demands on their bodies, they produce a vast amount of free radicals, and so they've got an immune system that's a lot more tolerant of damage. And it might be this tolerance that means that things like viruses can replicate within them, but it is a huge area of research at the moment.
What is the current thinking and evidence on quarantining people who have been over these areas into, back to Australia and other countries?
So that's a great question, and the big worry has been mandatory quarantine. So we know that people who are asymptomatic are completely non-infectious. So even if you're infected, if you don't show symptoms, you don't have a chance of passing it on. Even if you do have a fever, you don't really have a chance of passing this virus on. So what's more important is making sure people monitor their fever, and in Australia, we're recommending twice a day. And as soon as they have a fever, present to their nearest quarantine hospital. And that means that avoids any unnecessary quarantine, because there is no evidence for quarantining if you're asymptomatic.
Last question.
How do you overcome this religious practice of washing bodies after they've been infected and died?
So how do we deal with that?
Yes, because there's a religious practice there, but that seems to be one of the main areas of transmission. How do you overcome that mental approach?
unfortunately, that's actually been one of the hardest things to deal with. And in the beginning, it was a lack of having anthropologists and other people on the ground to actually understand these practices. What's happened is teams have been mobilized to actually do all burials. So effectively, burials have been taken out of the hands of villagers and put into the hands of professionals who know how to kit up and do it safely. There was a push at one point to do cremation, but that really is completely taboo. So we've moved away from cremation there and gone for this kind of halfway house where people can be involved in the burial by watching, but they can't directly touch. And I think people are now seeing the benefit of that. They're not seeing the cases in their communities.
Ladies and gentlemen, Grant Hill-Cawthorne.
Thank you.